The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. 360 Energy is a North American leader in energy and carbon reduction. Recently, we have launched the 360 Carbon Excellence Program, designed to make corporate climate change actions more effective and successful. For more information, check the link in our podcast description. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Well, thank you, Lysandra.
Good to be back.
All right, so today's episode is the many names of net zero carbon emissions. And even saying that, I hesitate to say many names of net zero carbon emissions because I feel like some of the names I'm about to list don't even relate to it. But that's where the whole confusion comes from. So in the media or online, especially for me, I see on LinkedIn posts constantly, we hear a lot of terms relating to the net zero carbon emission status. So businesses often use terms like net zero, carbon neutral, carbon free, low carbon, non-carbon emitting, and John's new term, if you listen to our last episode, carbon healthy. So we're just adding to this long list of names of carbon. And I just want to understand, why are these labels so popular? Why are we conforming to these labels? Why do businesses need to include these labels?
Okay, what you're talking about is a complete and utter, is it a word soup or a word salad? We've got all of that. And knowing we were going to talk about this, I thought to myself, I'll just have a quick look. And I did a quick Google search for climate neutral, because you didn't bring the climate one in. We can throw that in.
Yes.
Climate neutral versus climate positive. And in 0.44 of a second, I had 72 million pages on Google that refer to that. So I thought, okay, can we try something else? And I thought, okay, climate neutral versus net zero. That took much longer. That was 0.6 of a second, and it only came up with 28 million pages. So I think that starts to talk to some of the thing that's going on with this. I think the other thing as well is that I was looking at a public domain report from Royal Bank of Canada in their capital markets, their ESG themes for 2022. And they've got climate target technology varies across the 2,000 largest public traded companies globally. Here we go. And these are GHG neutrality, absolute emissions target, zero carbon, carbon negative, 1.5 degrees C target, climate positive, emissions intensity target, zero emissions, climate neutral, science-based target, others, emissions reduction target, carbon neutral neutrality, net zero, and no target. And in that survey of 2,000 of the largest companies, the largest score was 1,071, which had no target. But that doesn't mean to say that they're not using the language. So, okay, we've got all of that. What have we got there? Well, we've got a problem that I don't think we're going to solve in this podcast, but I will try and put it into a framework. What we've got is politics plus science plus marketing. And these three things have come together to give us the mix of what we've got going on here. So we know the big issue is climate change. So we should be doing something about climate. So that's why we get some of these climate expressions. But then, wait a minute, what is it that's causing climate change? It's GHGs. So, okay, perhaps we use GHGs or we use the word emissions. And then we move on a bit. Well, we've tried to standardize the accounting of GHGs by using CO2 equivalent. So we have CO2 equivalent, but then we shorten that. We just go, let's just say carbon. The problem, or a problem is whilst you can look up definitions for these, unlike certain things that have been around for a long time, if we looked into the financial accounting standards and things like that, there would be terminology like turnover, cost of sales, things like that, where you'd be able to look at a universal definition. We don't have that for all of these. So that becomes an issue. For example, up until recently, net zero, everybody would go, oh, what does net zero mean? Oh, it means that you've reduced your emissions and then you're balancing off what emissions you've got with some means of removing emissions from the atmosphere. And then along science-based targets come along and they go, yeah, you can do that, but you can't do it by a financial instrument, which is relatively new because their standard is only recently published. So we get all these kind of problems. Well, who are the Science-Based Target Initiative? They are not a global authority, although lots of people are signed up with them, and I'm not having a go at them. But what happens is that people then start to accept things like the GHG protocol as being the platform for doing accounting. So what we get is that we get people want to have targets. They want to say things. And I'm going to say here and now, one of the most useless statements a corporation can make is, we're going to be net zero by 2050. Now, why am I saying?
Yeah, I think it would be good because people are going. Like,
What
I
does
hope
that
people are.
mean?
I hope people are. The reason I say that is we don't really know what you mean when you say net zero. Do you mean genuine net zero where you haven't used financial instruments? Does it mean scopes 1, 2, and 3? So you've got all of that vagueness about that statement. And then, as they say, really? 2050 for a target?
So let's
A
roll
couple
that
of us
out.
might not be working in 2050.
Well, yeah, that's exactly. Let's roll that out, John, because we live this life and we actually see this frequently and are involved in this. So going on what John's saying, it's pretty easy to throw that out because the senior management won't be there and probably won't be there in 5 years' time. So they can come up with any label to sort of show, indicate that their company is doing something. And John and I have talked about this quite a bit. It actually sometimes with that type of label, it actually stops people from actually doing anything because they don't have to. It doesn't create progress. In fact, that's one option. The other option that we're finding is, okay, we got to do it, but I don't know what that means. It sounds really expensive. And it looks like it might impact my business in the short term. And my performance or my bonus is based on how my model works now. So I don't want to do anything on this. Like, it's just too complicated. So clearly, these acronyms or the items that have been identified, as you've mentioned, Sandra, is problematic, not only for understanding what it is, but actually making clients motivate to actually do something, really do something. And so that is a challenging and daunting exercise, which I think these terms have created confusion, but also it could be helpful for clients to use them so they don't have to do something. That's kind of my take, John. That's maybe somewhat jaded, but sort of what I see.
I think we're both a little jaded, but rightly so. I think you could say that we're pragmatic and we're realistic. Let me just say, there are organisations out there that are using the terminologies that we're talking about and are doing a good job. You know, they're walking their talk. They really are. And they're delivering on it. But I think that this is where we've got a complication. We've got this complex subject of climate change. We've got to the point now where I think we can accept the majority of people believe there is climate change, and a majority believe that it's what we're doing as human beings that's driving that climate change. Not everybody is signed up for that. I will just put a UK perspective on it. We now have somebody in our business and energy department who doesn't believe in climate change is something that's favourable for business. So there are issues there, but so we've got that. But then, because this is a complicated subject, we always want shorthand, jargon, acronyms. And I think we touched on this in a previous podcast, because of the confusion that there is around all of these things. Now, what we could do, and we're not going to do it in this podcast, we could take each of these terms apart, do pros and cons, balance them all off. What they are all trying to say is, in one way or another, we are committed to, or we have reduced our emissions that lead to climate change. That's what they're all trying to say, but in different ways. So we're pushing now, and make no bones about it, it's our view. We're pushing this view of the future is a low carbon economy. Not saying it's a zero carbon economy. Maybe it is, but in the next 5, 10, 20 years, it's going to be a lowering carbon economy. So the language that we're using, particularly with clients, is we're talking about the transition from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy. And that simplifies it to some extent. We think as well, I very strongly on this, I think there's a danger in setting yourself targets and using terminology when you don't fully understand what the impact of it is and how you're going to get there.
John,
Yeah.
I for our listeners, because you made a comment that we understand the validity of reducing carbon and that it's something that we don't think that you can do overnight. Maybe I'll dip into this because I know we have some listeners that are really very strong on this. Get rid of oil and gas tomorrow, like just get rid of them. And I think we've conveyed in the past, but I'll restate this. The truth is, society doesn't have the capacity to actually do that tomorrow. So I'll use real scenario. So for example, in Syria, I was doing some research for a client. If we got rid of some of the fossil fuels that we're using now, whether it's for heating or whether it's for process, whatever, effectively in Canada, in certain places, we would have to double the generation and grid. Double. Now, for people that aren't from the utility industry, I can tell you it takes years for them to plan and approve a transmission line, let alone a generation plant. So in summary, yes, it would be fantastic. And there's reasons why we want to do this quickly, but we can't because we don't have the knowledge base, we don't have the willpower, and we don't have that capacity to move that quickly. So I want to make sure our listeners understand why we say we will do it, but it's going to be a gradual process. And the faster, the better, but there's some bottlenecks that are restricting society to move as quickly as we should, to be clear.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid point. I can remember getting involved in this issue a long time ago and making the comment, we need to be investing in renewables, we need to be doing infrastructure. And we're talking a couple of decades ago, and making the point, we need to do that now so that we're future ready. And most of our developed countries have failed to do that. The warning signs were there, but the scale of the problem was one, as you say, people think, well, perhaps we don't need to do that. We're touching on it about utilities. One of the biggest differences is from centralized generation to distributed generation. The low carbon economy, the low carbon future has masses of distributed micro generation.
Mm-hmm.
It may equally have large renewable projects. We then have to be really careful in language. If we're talking clean energy, we might be able to put nuclear in there. Depends how you define clean. Nuclear is certainly a low carbon solution. But we all know on this podcast, you can't build a nuclear power station in 2 years.
Nope.
I mean, I know what the figure is for here. If you were to say today, I want to build a nuclear power station in Canada, when would it come online?
It's 7 years.
7 years. It would probably take us with the old, well, unless we got fast track, we'd be looking 10 to 15 years.
Wow.
That's why we have a transition.
That's correct. And referring to one of our past podcasts where we're talking about carbon storage and utilization, the same comment was made, is that it takes 5 to 7 years to get carbon storage and utilization in place. So
yeah.
So these now those are really high end, and there are some things to be clear to our audience. There's things that you could do today, like immediately, to help mitigate that. So it doesn't always have to be a high cost. As John started off, this is a buckshot, a silver buckshot. There's not one item that you can do and it's going to fix it. And so, but it is a transition. And so I think we need to be mindful of that. But at the same time, I think we need to make or encourage people through this podcast and other, so that they do start taking action now. Don't wait, but they do need to start taking action.
Can I take us back, though, to Lysandra's starting point about all this terminology?
Yeah.
What we've got to do, we've got to be good about it, and people have got to be good about it. When you see somebody says net zero, there is nothing wrong in actually asking for a qualification on what do you mean by net zero? Because I think we're not in a circumstance, actually asking that shows that you're informed, if you know what I mean. So you shouldn't feel, oh, I don't want to be stupid and ask, well, what is net zero? Good question is, what do you mean by net zero? That's the question that we should be asking people. And we shouldn't necessarily beat them up if their idea of net zero isn't exactly somebody else's. But what do you mean by net zero? And then the next intelligent question, how are you going to get there?
And as you said, John, going back to Lysandra's initial question, because of this diverse language, the different terms, is there some way that we should start coming up with one standard matrix in the future so people understand what it is? Because that confusion may stop people from actually advancing this type of activity as well.
I think that would be an ideal world, but I'll be careful here, but this is going public, so what the heck. Having sat on British standards and ISO committees, and anybody who has will know it takes an immense amount of work at that kind of level to get agreement on terminology.
Yeah, fair point. Fair.
Funnily enough, at one level, we may have to rely on people like the financial institutions and the accounting bodies and the financial reporting bodies, who might start saying, actually, we need some better definitions here.
Yes, because it's measurable.
Yeah. But it is the problem, and I think I mentioned it in our previous podcast about how everyone's become an energy expert. Equally, it's the apocryphal dinner party, and you're sat there and somebody starts expounding about net zero, and you think to yourself quietly, you haven't got a clue what you're talking about. And then the trouble is, you don't want to start the conversation and correct them because it isn't that straightforward to correct it. And I think in a way, here's where we go. People like the UN, which comes from UN, Conference of the Parties and all of that, they've tried to get these things simple with things like the race to net zero. We've got the new Canadian government, haven't we? Net zero challenge. We've got all of those things because they look to be something that you can hang action on and get common language. But if you take the Canadian net zero challenge, what is it? 21-page document that describes what it's about and what it means. I'm not saying it's 21 pages just to describe what net zero is, but how you go about it. So, yeah, I think what we've got to do, we've still got to use the language. We've got to be careful when we use it, and we've got to question it, but in a constructive way.
Mm-hmm.
I do think I understand what you've said about hearing people talk about it. It's encouraging that at least they're talking about it, John.
No argument, but it's just that, well, we all experienced this during the pandemic, didn't we? How many people became experts on viral infections?
Yeah.
Yeah. According to somebody on Twitter.
So just going back to businesses and labels, and when I think about this, I think a business chooses a label based on 3 different things. So 1, they want to, 2, they need to, and 3, they have to. So 1, they want to, maybe it looks good for marketing. Maybe the CEO is passionate about it. That's where I kind of see the want tos. Need to, maybe if you're a supplier and you're supplying to an automotive company or something, they're asking you, please tell us what you're doing. So you have to come up with some words. So you choose a word. And then there's the have tos, and you both already touched on it, but I think financial institutions are like, okay, what are you doing for this? And then you give them a word. Or maybe government at one point will be like, okay, we need everyone to let us know what they're doing to move to this net zero 2050. So there's the wants, the needs, the haves. And I think, depending on where you live, different things will be required of you. Depending on what industry you're in, different things will be required of you. Depending on your company and how you operate, different things will be required of you. And that's kind of where the next question comes in. Is it important for a business to choose a label? And should they stick with it?
Right. They shouldn't choose a label. They should choose a philosophy, perhaps. And they should actually, I'm going to say this, even though, carbon is our business, perhaps they should be looking at something that speaks more to sustainability, encompassing everything. And any company that's involved in consumer products is going to have to appeal to the individual. And I think as time goes on, people want to deal with companies that behave in an ethical way, that are trying to limit the damage. Yeah, and they want that at the lowest possible price in the real world, isn't it? How cheap can we get it?
Yeah, I would agree, John. As we've kind of alluded, we do work with a variety of organizations that are way ahead of the curve, and they're legitimate. When they've said they're net zero and they put it in their advertising, we know the due diligence that they've done and how
Yes.
comprehensive they are. And to be very candid, I'm thinking of Maple Leaf Foods, of how they're kind of leading the pack in the food industry, but also probably industry in Canada or North America and the work they're doing. And I think it's been really prudent by the senior management because they actually understand, one, it differentiates them. So it's a great business decision. But two, I think for marketing but also I think they realize it takes a long time to make this happen. And so they're going to be out in front of it and do it. And I think they think it's just going to be a good business decision. So I do understand your sustainability thing. Again, have this opinion that this whole climate change is more of an emphasis, but I think it's just because the seat I'm in, truthfully, that I look at that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think with companies taking on the view like Maple Leaf, and you could add into that Microsoft and a few others that are taking the view, they seem, despite the structures of their company, they seem to be able to say, yes, we've got to imagine what our organisation would be like in 2050. Now, I know I really sort of had a go at setting targets for 2050. That doesn't mean to say that I'm saying you shouldn't try to imagine or envision your corporation or your organisation in 2050, because you should. Trouble is, the stock market and other things as they are today aren't very supportive of that unless you're getting the return on investment today. And so there is this balancing act with all these things. You've got to, and I think that the word with this is, we talked about the transition to the low carbon economy. Perhaps there is the evolution to being a sustainable corporation. You can't do it in one step, but you've got to know where you're going. Now, evolution gets interesting, isn't it? Because when we evolved, we didn't know where we were going. We did it step by step. Now, I'm not saying that you do it blindly that way, but perhaps the company, the ideal corporation of the future, has this general idea of what it would be like in 2050, but every 5 years it's trying to make itself the best it can be in that time frame.
I think that's the ideal situation in that type of bracket, the 5-year window.
Yeah.
Well, I know we said for businesses to choose a philosophy instead of a label, but let's say a label is required. They want it for marketing. They want it to put it on their website. They want it to let their clients know. How does a business determine which of these labels best suits them?
Okay, one of the ways is if you're part of a supply chain, you may well get pressure on you to sign up to a program like SBTI or CDP or something else like that. Now, if you've got that kind of pressure, then you probably need to align with that kind of label. And funnily enough, at least if you go the Science-Based Targets Initiative, I've got issues around how you actually do that and everything else that we could discuss. But in a simple term, at least if you say we have a SBTI aligned and approved target, somebody can go away and look up and find out exactly what that means. So that's pretty robust. But I think if you're not sure about what your label should be, perhaps you should be saying that you're working to be a low carbon company, because I think that speaks to it, and it has a degree of vagueness that is appropriate if you don't actually know what you're doing.
I think businesses need to keep in mind too, if you're writing something online and you're saying that you're doing this, people are going to hold you accountable for that label.
Absolutely.
If you don't define that label, they're holding you accountable for that definition that they believe is accurate to that label.
You're absolutely right. You said about changing it. I don't know if you see it here in the UK and Europe. We get companies that have a strap line against their company name, and they have one for 3 years and then change it to something else. And you're thinking, well, have you changed your philosophy? Have you changed what you are? You know, people want a degree of consistency. I mean, being very, not really wanting to bring things down, but as you probably know, whilst we're recording this, we're in a national state of mourning in the UK for the loss of Queen Elizabeth. Now, we've got issues going on with Republicans having their say about continuity, but one of the things that somebody like Queen Elizabeth provided for the UK was a consistency of message. You could look, another head of state or something could look at Queen Elizabeth and go, okay, so that's the core values of what the UK is. And I think corporations have to be the same. They want to be trusted. You have to keep on message. You have to know what that message is. And I think you are so right. You can really damage your brand by making a very bold statement. Well, in fact, you become a politician, because politicians, when they want you to vote for them, they say, we will do this, we will do that. Then when they get in office, they go, maybe we can't do that. Corporations shouldn't be like that. They should deliver on what they say.
The good corporations, John, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's what distinguishes a good corporation from the rest. All right. Well, on that note, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners from today's episode?
Dave.
I think it was really well summarized at the end, and that is, in summary, if you're going to pick a label, whatever that might be, and because for whatever reason, you want to do it, you need to do it, you have to do it, just make sure you have clarity of what that means, and make sure you live it, you measure it, and you make it transparent to all parties, so there's a trust factor and understood by the marketplace. I think if you did that, I think you'll be heads above a lot of people. And it sounds simple, but the corporations aren't typically set up to do that. So I think when you do that, it will serve you well.
John?
Okay, I'll go back to mine, which is, I think one of the things you've got to do is ask people when you're looking at organisation, what do you mean by net zero or your label, and how are you going to get there? Don't be afraid to ask not challenging, but not aggressive questions. I think that will help everybody.
Agreed. I think for me, when I look at businesses taking these labels, I think of, first of all, as an employee, what do I value from my employer? I value integrity, I value honesty, and I value trust. And once you break that relationship, you lose a lot of credibility. I think that businesses need to look at these terms and do that with the public. Just as you do this with your employees and, with your business model, you need to understand that those qualities are looked for towards you by the public as well. And that, again, goes back into what John and Dave both said, making sure that whatever business label you get or you decide to take on, you're actually doing.
Here,
All right. Thanks again for another great recording.
Till the next time.
And look forward to it again. Thanks, everyone.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.